G'day. I've got some friends, and they love making margaritas. So much so, they turned it into a business. 2 years ago, they asked me to make some display shelves to replace their standard IKEA ones. But time got in the way and we kind of all just forgot about it. Well, almost all of us. Whoa, I better get started. The brief was simple. Something elegant, on brand, think Palm Springs and maybe a bit Art Deco. They need to hold tequila, salt, and of course, they're no fuss, easy as a Sunday morning Listo mix. I was really drawn to the idea of making the lime and agave symbol from their logo. But then my friends asked me to make this. So in the end, I decided I'll just make both. Let's begin. I'm going to use 10mm steel rod welded into a frame which will support some plywood shelves. Now it's not the most forgiving design to weld. The steel rod has a habit of rolling away from you. So to support everything in place, I figured I'll make a welding template on top of this folding table, which I can pack down, move and change as needed. The plan is to build the back and front as two pieces. With the template, these will come out identical and I won't have to worry about runaway steel or out of square joints. Since I'm now making two shelves, spending the time on the template once saves me having to measure 4 times in the future. Using plywood, I cut out the dimensions between rails and set them apart with the steel rod as the spacer. I know I want the curved back rail to be one piece, not the less elegant alternative of a spliced quarter circle with a joint. This will mean bending the rod around a perfect radius. So using the router, I cut out the shape I needed and tested if it was even bendable. Now steel inherently has a lot of tension when you cold bend it, so it just kept springing back. So I made a new jig which allowed me to bend it beyond the point where the curve started, hoping it would spring back straight. Without even pressure, the bend was a bit distorted, so I sketched out a pretty basic bending arm to give me some mechanical leverage. Now that I'm working with metal, I guess it's time to set up the alfresco workshop, because you know, no one really wants to be sued for blinding a dog. Before committing to the new jig, I quickly tested my first bend in the template to see if welding a rail would lock the curve in place. And it did. I tack welded this pin on the outside radius of the steel and locked the arm down with a small bolt. I then marked the starting and centre points of the curve on the longest bits of steel I had and calculated that I was short by about 15mm. The universe smiled on me, and as I muscled that bending arm around, the steel stretched, giving me that extra length. Despite breaking the shoddy weld on the pin, the bends worked out just as I had hoped. Usually I only make one-of-a-kind bespoke projects with some sort of plan, but after setting up a template like this, the efficiency of making 2 or 3 became really appealing. Not to mention the satisfaction of just being a one-man production line. Improving the process and my skills the more times I repeated something. So in future, I think I'll try and make 2 of everything. Limited to 2, so I can retain that bespoke nature of what I make. Then I can keep one and sell one and buy more tools. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you don't weld all the time, it can take a few goes to get your eye and hands back into the swing of things. So what you're seeing here is me tack welding the top and then working my way around, filling the gap and hitting the corners. And lighting my table on fire. After no time at all, both the backs were made. They were identical and perfectly square. And not to hark on about it, but I love this template, as you can see by that little nod of approval to myself. Moving on, I repeated all the same steps for the front with the exception of the bend, as the top rail here will stop at the shelf. Anytime I weld, it seems to rain. You can swing a hammer or use a drill in the rain, but welding and water really should never mix. If this is a warning from an almighty power, I'll take it with fairy lights, thanks. I'm kicking things off with the design my friend sent me. This kind of art deco sunrise. The devil here is with the alignment of all the pieces, so it was critical to take the time to measure and mark out all the junctions. But the real difficulty would be these little semicircles. I only needed 4, so I didn't want to make another bending arm and instead gave it a go with some elbow grease on this small jig. It sort of worked, but the bend was wonky. I also tried the same thing with a different jig, this time using an old flywheel and a bit of steel welded across the top. But as you'd expect, it was basically the same result. Before investing the time to fashion up an elaborate bending arm with bearings and all that other fancy stuff, I had another go, and through trial and error quickly realised my issue was not in how it was bending, but how far it was bending. By completing a full revolution, I was sure to get one good semicircle out of each, and in the end they were all pretty much the same. A hot tip when cutting circles is to use the edge of a table as your guideline, instead of just a ruler and marker. Once tacked into place, I could take the final dimension of all the straight pieces for a cutting list and worked my way up scribing the angles as I went. By the last one, I was so deep in some kind of trance that I didn't even notice I was on fire. So, a lesson for all. Remember to stand next to your grinder, or just put on better protective clothing. On that note, trying to do anything in welding gloves is difficult, like buttering a hot cross bun or going to the toilet. But trying to hold these rollicking rods dead straight was a nightmare. The filament would sometimes push them out before the weld began, so a few times I had to cut and re-weld to make sure it was straight. The persistence paid off, and the gloves and me had become one. With my friend's concept done, I could now move on to my own design. The two main features of this design are the lime and agave plant. But what I thought would look great is how these would intersect with the rails of the frame, sort of like a stained glass window without the glass. Freehand drawing isn't always the quickest, but it's great for figuring out the right scale and orientation and helps strengthen your intuition when designing and making. Now, my original intention was to hot bend the lime, but my fireplace was more of a pond than a forge. So the obvious alternative was to cold bend over this log, working it back and forth until I got the shape I wanted. Bending metal this kind of way is a little bit more intuitive. You're sort of feeling it as you go. In this case, I'm marking out the points that I need to change and then going back and working it a little bit further. It's not as precise as hot bending, but it's pretty effective when you want it to be. Here I'm getting that all-important bird's eye view to make sure the cut lines I'm marking are parallel with the dividing rails. Unlike wood, I find there is a certain degree of freedom with metal. If I cut too much, I can always add more with a weld. But the more you weld, the more you have to grind, and the messier that junction will be. So I guess the moral is, just make things good the first time. Yep, those are words to live by. Heating and bending metal is a bit of a pastime for me. But this little plumber's torch and my janky hammer setup didn't quite achieve what I was after. That's the problem with alfresco working. I didn't have a vise, but back down in the workshop I do have a vise. And with that, I tried a few different ways to bend and push and move the metal to get the right angles for these agave fronts. Once laid out, it was more of the same, so I'll just skip over that. With both of them done, the grinders are back out with flap discs and cut-off wheels, and the long process of tidying up joints and cleaning weld spatter began. My original idea was to support the shelves on top of the rails and have cutouts around the vertical bits. But it occurred to me a more elegant detail would have the shelves flush with the front and back rails. If you agree, let me know by subscribing. To make this repeatable for both pieces, I used the template and pushed the back panel out of alignment. Now I was sure that each side rail would be dropped down the same distance relative to the front and back. If I was out, I would be equally out on all of the rails and would only have to adjust the depth of the shelf rebend. You may think I'm pondering some big philosophical thought like, the secret of happiness is not found in seeking more but in developing the capacity to enjoy less. But you'd be wrong. I'm debating whether I cut up my beloved template. I'll admit I thought about that for too long, but you know what they say. He who moves the first tree may never find the path again. I could have put the frame back into the template and welded the remaining side rails, but I thought it would be better to do them one at a time, using the shelf as a flat reference point. Despite the template, there were some points where I was occasionally out, so doing it the manual way made sure I could adjust them as needed. Oh, and also the shelf kept everything, nice and square. The first one was now finished and looking good, but as I celebrated with a cup of coffee, it struck me. The back is backwards. Well, that was a bit of an overreaction. Now you'd be thinking, well, that shouldn't matter, it's the same. I hit a few welding mistakes and slips with a grinder at the back, and now they're at the front. It's not the end of the world, it's just going to be a lot more work. That wasn't to be my last blunder. I was so sure the finished frame would stand perfectly still because of, the template. But clearly that's not the case. And I couldn't figure it out. Everything was square and the measurements the same. I added some weld and ground it back, but it still wasn't level. And it didn't matter where in the house I put it, so it couldn't be the floor. It turns out it was the floor. So I hit Ctrl-Z on my changes and everything was okay again. All there was left to do now was to make some shelves and paint. I'm using the best plywood I could buy, so the final paint finish will be smooth and crisp. The shelves are 12mm thick, 400mm wide and 280 deep. Sorry, 279 deep because of, paint thickness. Since my rebate on the router wasn't wide enough, I had to score the inner cut first with the table saw before finishing it off with the router. I know what you're thinking, the rebate won't leave much left for the shelf to hold stuff on, and I thought that too. So before doing all this, I gave it a little test. Unfortunately, it was another week before I could paint, and inevitably this happened. So while I sand that off, maybe sit back and grab yourself a margarita. It's as easy as 1, 2, and 3. After a quick clean, I began giving the frame a priming coat. I had done a lot of research on the best spray cans to use, and what you're seeing here is me jumping to conclusions, when the can started spitting huge gullies of paint all over the frame. But I was a little biased in my thinking from all the bad reviews I read. As it turns out, I just needed to shake the can more. So remember, it's okay to shake more than twice. Once primed, I gave the shelves and the frame 2 top coats in a semi-gloss finish, with some light sanding between. It's a bit of a tedious process, so here's 3 days of painting all at once. After some back and forth on what kind of colour to go with, I finally settled on possum white. A slight off-white which gives that warmth of a Palm Springs afternoon by the pool. Although I can't imagine too many possums are sipping margs out in the Californian desert. On paper these shelves look pretty simple. Some steel rod and sheets of ply. But the simplest things always seem to be the hardest to make. All in all, I think they worked out really well, and it was great to finally help out some good friends and make a cool project in the process. But the best part, a year's supply of mugs. Thanks for watching.